It seemed like it would be another ordinary day at the hospital. The early morning rush had already settled into a rhythm, with the constant chatter of nurses, doctors, and patients filling the air. Machines beeped steadily, and the hospital's energy was a mix of stress and purpose. Nia, a black nurse who had been at this hospital for nearly 5 years, knew the pace well. She had grown accustomed to the chaos that came with working in the emergency room, never knowing what challenge the next moment would bring. But today, the tension in the air felt different. Nia had always been dedicated to her work. She was efficient, compassionate, and knowledgeable. She had earned the respect of her colleagues over the years through her dedication and care. But there was one person who hadn't seemed to notice: Dr. Matthews. Matthews was a senior physician with a reputation that preceded him, and not in a good way. He was known for his sharp tongue, his arrogance, and his cold, dismissive attitude toward everyone beneath him. Nia had long since learned to tolerate his rude comments. She'd heard them all before. Those remarks that cut just deep enough to sting but never quite enough to break her. But today, something inside her snapped. Nia was busy adjusting an IV line on a patient when Dr. Matthews approached, clipboard in hand. He was deep in conversation with one of the residents, but when he saw Nia, he suddenly shifted his attention to her. He glanced her way with that all-too-familiar sneer, his lips curling into a condescending smile. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, sizing her up as if she were somehow beneath him. "What's the point of even asking questions?" he muttered, loud enough for her to hear. "You probably don't even understand half of what's on this chart." He scoffed as he gave her a once-over, his eyes moving from her shoes to the top of her head. "Just do your job and let the real doctors handle the rest." Nia's stomach tightened. His words weren't just harsh, they were personal. She'd dealt with similar comments in the past, but today, his dismissal felt like a slap in the face. She had worked so hard to get to where she was, learning, growing, sacrificing. And here he was, acting as though all that effort meant nothing. His arrogance was palpable, and it made her insides churn with a mix of frustration and anger. But worse than the words was the tone, the way he seemed to think she was incapable of understanding her job, as if her expertise didn't matter. Her pulse quickened, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. The humiliation was overwhelming. She wanted to shout back, to demand respect, to tell him how wrong he was. But instead she stood there, forcing herself to stay composed. Nia had learned, over the years, that sometimes silence was the only weapon you had. So, she nodded stiffly, pretending to accept his insult, before turning to walk away. But as she left, her emotions didn't just vanish. The sting of his words lingered like a bad taste in her mouth. Her mind raced. How could he think that of her? She was good at what she did. She knew she was, and yet his words made her feel small, invisible. She could feel the tears building up, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not now. She had faced worse, and she wasn't going to let him see that he had gotten to her. As she walked down the hallway, her mind kept replaying the moment over and over. It wasn't just about his comment. It was about the sheer unfairness of it all. How many times had she, and others like her, been dismissed or belittled? How many times had her hard work been ignored, simply because of her role, her race, her gender? It wasn't right. But there was nothing she could do right now. Or was there? Nia had always kept a lot to herself, especially about her career. She had always been humble, never eager to brag about her accomplishments or her position. But what Dr. Matthews didn't know was that Nia wasn't just any nurse. She was the newly appointed medical director of the hospital. It was a role she had earned through years of tireless dedication, a deep understanding of patient care, and a commitment to improving the hospital's operations. But she hadn't told anyone yet. She didn't want her new title to be the first thing people noticed about her. She wanted to prove herself first, not for the position, but for the change she could bring. For months, she had worked behind the scenes, overseeing hospital policies, managing staff, and improving patient care. It wasn't an easy job, and it wasn't one that was widely recognized, especially not by someone like Dr. Matthews. Nia wasn't concerned with titles or accolades. She didn't need anyone to know about her position. But that all changed when she overheard a conversation that afternoon. Nia had been walking through the hospital's main hallway when she overheard Dr. Matthews talking to some of his colleagues. He was laughing, his voice loud and arrogant as he recounted their earlier interaction. "I really put that nurse in her place," he said, his words dripping with pride. "She thought she could question me. I swear, these people think they know better just because they've been here longer. She's probably lucky I even gave her the time of day." The laughter that followed only fueled Nia's anger. She stood frozen, unable to move, as the words washed over her. His mockery, his blatant disrespect, it stung all over again. But this time, it was different. She wasn't just another nurse anymore. She wasn't just someone he could belittle without consequence. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much for him to think he could get away with this. Her fists clenched at her sides as her heart pounded in her chest. She had never felt this angry before. This wasn't just about the insult anymore. This was about all the times for years that people like Dr. Matthews had treated her and others like her as inferior. The way they dismissed them, belittled them, and then acted as if nothing was wrong. "This ends today," she thought, her mind made up. She wasn't going to let it slide. She wasn't going to let him think he could continue to get away with his behavior. It was time for him to face the consequences of his words. With a deep breath, she turned on her heel and walked toward the lounge where Dr. Matthews and his colleagues were sitting. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she knew one thing. It was time for a change, and she would be the one to make sure of it. Nia stood at the entrance of the staff lounge, her mind racing. She had never imagined she'd be walking into this room under these circumstances, but there was no turning back now. The sound of voices inside, laughter, the clinking of coffee mugs, faded the closer she got. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. As soon as she stepped inside, the room fell silent. Every single eye in the room turned toward her, their expressions shifting from casual to confused to something else entirely. Dr. Matthews, seated at the far end of the room with a few of his colleagues, didn't immediately recognize her. His arrogance had clouded any understanding of who she might actually be. He leaned back in his chair, the smug grin spreading across his face. "Oh, I didn't expect you to come around here," he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Are you looking for another lesson in how to do your job?" The words hit Nia like a punch to the gut, but this time she didn't flinch. Instead, she stood tall, her spine straightening. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her resolve was solid. She had made up her mind. There would be no turning back. She took a deep breath and stepped further into the room, her gaze locking with Dr. Matthews as she spoke. "Dr. Matthews," she began, her voice steady but carrying the weight of years of hard work and determination. "I think you should know something about me." The room, already tense, grew even quieter. The weight of her words hung in the air. Dr. Matthews' grin faltered, but he didn't yet understand what was happening. He stared at her, waiting for her to finish. Nia paused for a moment, letting the tension stretch, the silence almost suffocating. And then, with a calm that surprised even herself, she spoke louder. "I'm the new medical director here. I've been appointed to this role to oversee the entire hospital's operations, including your department." The shock on Dr. Matthews' face was almost comical. His expression shifted rapidly, from a mix of disbelief to confusion, and finally to panic. The room behind him buzzed with whispers. The colleagues who had been laughing just moments before were now wide-eyed, looking between Nia and Dr. Matthews. "You? What?" Dr. Matthews stammered, unable to process what she had just said. Nia didn't let him off the hook. "You humiliated me earlier today, and now I'm going to ensure that everyone understands that your behavior is unacceptable." She took a step forward, letting the words sink in. "No one, no matter their title or rank, should be treated the way you treated me." There was no anger in her voice, only quiet determination. She wasn't shouting or ranting. She was simply stating the truth. And that truth carried more weight than any insult. With that, Nia turned on her heel and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing in the now deafening silence. As she left, she could feel the eyes of the room still on her. But this time, it didn't matter. She had said what needed to be said. Dr. Matthews could no longer hide behind his smug superiority. And for the first time in her life, Nia felt like she had finally stood up for herself in a way that couldn't be ignored. Dr. Matthews stood frozen in the middle of the room, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing, as if trying to find something, anything to say. But there was nothing left to say. He had made his mistake, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. The next few days at the hospital were nothing short of intense. Word of the confrontation between Nia and Dr. Matthews spread quickly. It wasn't long before everyone knew what had happened in the staff lounge. Some people were supportive, nodding in quiet approval of Nia's bravery. Others, particularly those who had witnessed Dr. Matthews' arrogance firsthand, were less surprised but equally impressed. But there were also those who didn't know what to think. To them, it was just drama, another hospital scandal. But for Nia, it wasn't about the drama. It was about making sure the environment was one of respect, not condescension. The hospital had a strict zero-tolerance policy when it came to discrimination, and it wasn't long before Dr. Matthews was called into a meeting with the hospital board. Nia's decision to speak out had set in motion a process that no one could reverse. Dr. Matthews was told to take a leave of absence pending an investigation into his conduct. The humiliation Nia had suffered wasn't just personal. It was something that affected the whole hospital. If the staff saw someone in power like Dr. Matthews behaving this way, they might think it was okay. But it wasn't, and the hospital needed to make that clear. As for Nia, she found herself facing a new kind of challenge. Despite the overwhelming support from some of her colleagues, she couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed in ways she wasn't ready for. People who had once passed her by now regarded her with respect, even awe. She had earned the title of medical director almost overnight, but it wasn't the victory she had imagined. The respect she had always sought had come to her in the wake of a humiliating public confrontation, something that should never have been necessary. She couldn't help but wish that it hadn't taken this incident to prove her worth. But despite the discomfort she felt in some of her newfound attention, she was starting to believe that this moment was the beginning of something much bigger. For the first time, Nia felt like she had the power to make real change. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She wasn't just someone who took orders. She was a leader. It wasn't about the title, it was about the responsibility. The fight for respect, equality, and fairness had only just begun. Nia was determined to lead in a way that would create a hospital where everyone, no matter their role or background, could feel valued. The pain of the past few days would stay with her for a long time, but it had also been the catalyst for something important. She wasn't going to back down. Not this time. In the quiet of her office later that week, Nia reflected on the path ahead. The work was just beginning. There would be many more challenges, more fights to be had. But Nia wasn't afraid. She had fought for herself, and now she was going to fight for every person who had ever been made to feel less than. She had a new role to play, and this time she wasn't going to be silenced. Weeks passed, and Nia settled into her role more comfortably. She began introducing new training programs for all hospital staff, focused on diversity, respect, and equality. She wanted to make sure that no one else would ever have to endure the same kind of treatment she had. One afternoon, she walked through the halls of the hospital, seeing her vision starting to come to life. Nurses and doctors alike were engaging in respectful discussions, helping each other, and working as a team. The atmosphere was changing, and it was all thanks to her. But Nia knew the fight wasn't over. There were still many challenges ahead. There were still people, like Dr. Matthews, who thought they could get away with mistreating others. But now, Nia had the power to make sure they wouldn't. She was determined to lead with strength and compassion, showing everyone that no one should ever feel less than because of the color of their skin or their job title. And just like that, the hospital was slowly becoming a better place for everyone. Hey there, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more powerful, real, and emotional content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if it resonated with you, and leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions. If you think someone else could benefit from this story, be sure to share it with them. Your support means the world and helps me bring more of these stories to life. Thanks again, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.